Welcome, everyone, to our weekly CMMC Roundtable. Very exciting today because we have Justin Orcutt from Microsoft, the public sector team. He's going to be sharing insights with us regarding GCC, GCC High, the difference between Microsoft 365. Those are questions I get every day from clients, but I'm happy to have a subject matter expert here that can dive into the nitty gritty and give you behind the scenes of how it all works. As with all our weekly roundtables, it's informal. Justin does have some slides he's going to share, but we will spend the bulk of the time opening it up for questions. Be nice to Justin. Don't grill him too hard, but be sure to, if you have questions, this is the environment for you to ask those and hopefully get your questions answered. But with that being said, Justin, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's a great opportunity to talk to you guys and exchange some experiences, some lessons learned, and what's going on out there in the market. Do you want me to kick it off with a quick intro and then just jump into the material?
I'll let you take it from here. You're the main attraction.
Cool. All right. Well, so everyone, I've been at Microsoft for almost 4 years now. April will be my 4-year anniversary. And prior to joining Microsoft, I worked at a 3PAO, two different 3PAOs, so NCC Group and Coalfire, where I helped assist software companies that were going through the FedRAMP authorization process, or companies that had to deal with different types of security requirements, things like PCI, HIPAA, high trust, ISO, and the list goes on and on. So the audit space is not something that is new to me. In fact, it excites me. I love being able to speak to assessors and auditors and risk folks, because that is kind of my comfort zone. So thanks again for having me. I'm lucky that I get to work at Microsoft and I get to work with defense contractors of all sizes. So, really, there is no standard for what type of companies we talk to. We're often engaged with conversations from small organizations that are going through DFARS for the first time, DFARS 7012, or companies with really robust compliance programs that have already gone through a joint surveillance audit, and now they're trying to figure out, how do I prepare for level 3 potentially. So there's a spectrum. What I wanted to share with you guys is just how do we talk to our customers that are using our Microsoft platforms, and how ultimately you can help them out when they think about what kind of technologies they could use in order to achieve their CMMC compliance. So Microsoft, we've been following what's been going on with CMMC since it first came out. There's a number of blogs that you'll see out there, mostly from Richard Wakeman. Richard is kind of the godfather when it comes to all things CMMC. And what we do as a cloud service provider is we maintain compliance for our areas of shared responsibility and give you the documentation and the information you need in order to be successful with your own audit. So there's a number of things that no matter what type of certification you're pursuing, you could leverage some of this material. And why is CMMC and when you think about Microsoft and our CMMC program, as I mentioned, we're tracking it for most of our customers. They're targeting CMMC level 2, under, I guess now we just call it CMMC, right? No 2.0. And we typically recommend Azure Gov and GCC High for these entities. And the reason for that is most of our defense contractors come to us because they're dealing with CUI. And the variety of CUI is really unknown. They're not sure where all the CUI lies. They're not sure what types of CUI they have, right? Is it basic? Is it specified? Are there additional security requirements that they need to adhere to? So when you're strategizing high level, it makes sense to start assuming everything is in scope. CUI touches everything. And then we work with partners to develop cloud native environments that are using secure by default principles that align to some of the things that you're seeing with zero trust nowadays. A lot of our partners have developed their own infrastructure as code with their own standard deployments in order to achieve CMMC compliance. We see a lot of fully hosted cloud environments where folks can use it in an enclave model if they wanted. We also support in a pre-configured setting a swivel seat, so the ability to go in and out of GCC High as needed. Or there's some contractors that offer we call it a meet me model, where you might have a tenant that is for guest collaboration. And again, working with our partners, we develop a robust ecosystem of managed solutions. That way, if you are a smaller company and you don't have the in-house capability to manage those services on your own, that we have partners that can help you out with that. CMMC is really important to Microsoft. First and foremost, we're a cloud service provider, right? That's the services that you consume or your customers consume from Microsoft. And as such, we have obligations that we need to meet in order for our customers to meet their requirements, like FedRAMP authorization. So as a cloud service provider, we have a set of requirements that are different from our business as a systems integrator. So we also go in and we help implement these systems. And we take those lessons learned of what we do while implementing, and we bring that back to our engineering teams to say, here's how we could make the product better, stronger, faster. And then we're also a defense contractor. So we were one of the first organizations to go through a joint surveillance audit when they became available. And we've kind of released some lessons learned on that. And you can find that on our public tech sector blog if you're interested in taking a look at that. We have different cloud environments for different purposes. So most organizations are familiar with our commercial environment, and that is where a lot of the world consumes Microsoft services, whether it's Word, Exchange, PowerPoint, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, Lists, To Do, Viva, the list goes on and on. So it's really that commercial cloud that most organizations are using. And then because all of you are familiar with CMMC, you know that we have these other environments, GCC and GCC High. And in those environments, we can help maintain higher levels of security because there's different processes for us operating those platforms. And then we also have different classified environments, secret and top secret. What makes Microsoft unique in terms of CMMC is we're not offering a spot solution to address a problem. Like for instance, we are not offering an email solution where you're sending email from point A to point B, and that's the full scope of what we're offering. We're offering a complete platform to do what you need to do with CUI. So an example of that is you need to send that data from point A to point B, but there's a bunch of security controls that you need to wrap that process with. And then you need visibility for things like security operations or endpoint detection. So we provide those capabilities. A lot of defense contractors trust Microsoft really because of four main principles that we have, which is security, privacy, compliance, and transparency. And those are the things that we offer to customers to help make their journey in the cloud a lot easier. When I say we're the complete cloud, what I mean is we have a productivity environment. So that's anything with M365. We have a automation platform known as Power Platform. So some of you may be using things like Power Apps or Power Flows. That is our Power Platform. And then we have Dynamics 365. You could think of that as CRM or ERP or supply chain risk management tools or finance tools to help you manage those sort of processes. We have development environments, so GitHub Enterprise or things like DevOps Server or a variety of other capabilities to help with coding and SDLC pipeline. And then we have our Azure OpenAI services. Is there anyone here that hasn't heard of AI? Raise your hand. All right, good. Everybody's heard of that. So we have our AI services that are currently in our government clouds as well. And then we have infrastructure as a service, which you could use in order to build any solution that you have. All of that is built on this foundation though, of security, compliance, and identity capabilities. So one of the things that makes our government clouds unique is our ability to isolate the identity because it is not shared with a commercial cloud. So what does this look like? Here is a quick illustration. So again, different environments for different purposes. Most folks know of this environment, which is M365. That flows down and cascades into commercial, and it's built on top of Azure Commercial, which means worldwide routing, worldwide data centers, data at rest, data in transit, could be anywhere. You could deploy additional capabilities to restrict where that data is. So you have some of those capabilities. Also built on Azure Commercial is our GCC environment. So this was the environment that we really built for state and local governments to be able to use when they had a need for a different Office 365 environment. When we started offering SaaS as a service, the government came to us wanting to get rid of managing the hardware for SharePoint, but they need an environment that achieves certain impact levels. So we built out a completely new environment with that isolated identity, because this is where Entra lives, is inside Azure. And we called it Azure Gov. So our first use case was running SharePoint server in the cloud. And that quickly became our DoD environment where we offered SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and a bunch of other capabilities. Right around that same time frame, DFARS came out, 7012, and defense contractors came to Microsoft and said, hey, we want to use these cloud services, but in order to use cloud services, we need to be inside of a DoD tenant. Well, we can't put any defense contractors inside a DoD tenant, only DoD can do that. So what we did is we built a copy of our DoD environment, and today we call it GCC High. So GCC High leverages the same infrastructure, the same support model, same resources as the DoD tenant, but it is separate from the DoD tenant. And as you can tell, there's a line running down here. These two worlds initially, when we built them, were designed not to talk to each other, not to communicate with one another. But what we quickly found out is DoD is constantly talking to commercial. GCC High companies are constantly talking to commercial. So over the years, we've built out the capability to allow those worlds to communicate with one another. That way they can continue to be productive and have effective meetings. You might look at this and you might say, well, which cloud environment is the correct environment for my customers? We have this great mapping. This is out on Microsoft's blog as well, our public tech sector community. And you might look down this. The first requirement that came out was DFARS 7012. The interesting thing about DFARS 7012 is it requires you to use FedRAMP authorized solutions or equivalent. And in 7012, you also need to be able to flow down contractual requirements known as clauses C through G to your service providers. We cannot achieve that requirement inside of commercial, so we say no to DFARS 7012. Now, I talk to a lot of people all day long, and they say, hey, my requirement for this project is I need to be prepared for CMMC level 2 or level 1. Can I do that inside of your commercial environments? For level 1, where you have FCI, the answer is yes, like absolutely. You could deploy those 15 controls that you have. For CMMC level 2, that includes CUI, unless we know what types of CUI specifically. That way we could rule out any specified or any ITAR data. The safe answer is no, that environment's not built for that. The tricky part here is, can you achieve 171 inside of a commercial environment? The answer is yes. So you could deploy those 110 controls to meet all of those test objectives, but the pieces that are in 7012 or the pieces that are in specified CUI in terms of enhanced security controls that you have, you might not be able to meet those in commercial. So be cautious, make sure that customers know being CMMC compliant is more than just the technical controls. If you have a CMMC clause, you likely have a 7012 clause. And if you have a CMMC clause, you have a bunch of CUI. What types of CUI do you have? Do you know where that CUI is? How are you currently protecting that today? Is that in cloud or out of cloud, right? There's just a lot of questions to peel back there. And then you could look at our GCC environment and you could say, yep, meets the 7012 requirements. We could sign those flow downs. You could do level 1, you could do level 2. The part where it changes is ITAR or no foreign. And the reason for that is it's built inside Azure Commercial. So again, worldwide routing, worldwide data centers. And the support model is a commercial support model, meaning when you have an issue and you contact help desk and you need to take trace logs and everything else, that is a commercial worldwide team supporting you. Whereas the government environment, so let's say Azure Gov and work our way up, Azure Government is a sovereign cloud that is US based and has restricted person. Sorry, did somebody have a question?
I'll keep going. I'll see if somebody mute someone.
So, only US-based personnel. And then if you work your way up, you could say like, yep, you can achieve 171 requirements. You could achieve ITAR requirements there. You could achieve CUI and CMMC level 2 and 3, level 1, 7012. And one of the main reasons for that is our GCC High environment is FedRAMP High authorized. And I say authorized with a smile because over the winter holiday this year, we finally got out of that equivalency stage and we got on the marketplace as fully authorized. So a nice big milestone for us there.
Celebrate, pop some champagne.
Pop some champagne there. It was exciting for all of us that have been tracking it for a while because until then, we needed to prepare this giant thing called a body of evidence. And it led to Microsoft kind of changing our position as related to M365 commercial, because no longer could we, you guys probably know this, right? Because you're all part of the community, you're paying attention to what's going on. December of 2023, DoD came out with a memo defining what is equivalent, and it required you to go through a 3PAO audit and have, a SAR and a RAR and, pen testing results and all this information complete on an annual basis and ready for a customer to review as part of their own assessment. So, we just couldn't achieve that in commercial. And in GCC high, since we weren't fully authorized, we had to provide a body of evidence to any customer going through it up until just recently. So super exciting. So the lesson there is, if you're going through a DIB-CAC audit, or if you're going through a CMMC assessment and somebody is on GCC high and they're asking for a body of evidence, what they really need is they need the FedRAMP authorization package and the scope. They don't need the body of evidence anymore. And that's something new as of, not even 30 days ago.
A quick question on the previous slide. Could you go back one?
Sure. Yep. Let me work my way back. 1 second here. Forwards is always easier than backwards. All right, there you go.
So in here you say eligible contractors, the DIB. What if somebody is not in the DIB yet? They want to get in the DIB. They want to build an environment to be able to bid on government contracts. What is your policy there on current or potential?
Yep. So unlike other cloud environments, you have to be confirmed as eligible in order to use our government cloud services. And that's because of our relationship with the government and, them requiring us to have certain, it's how the service is built. So, only certain folks are allowed in. So you need one of three things in order to be confirmed eligible. You either need to be a government contractor registered with a CAGE code, which demonstrates that, yes, you do work with the government or you're pursuing government work. So that's one. Two is you need to show a contract where you have requirements for any of these areas, right? You have a CMMC clause, a 7012 clause, a ITAR clause, whatever. You need to show that you have restricted data that needs protection, which if you have that, chances are you have a CAGE code. And then the third one, if you're new and you're just trying to get started, you're probably partnering with somebody in order to win that contract. You're probably working with maybe even an agency because you have a unique capability, in which case you'd be required to have a sponsor letter. And we have a template for the sponsor letter. We just need somebody that already has these requirements, that are already, within the environment, to sponsor you and say, yes, you can meet that requirement. Why does Microsoft care? It's because of the way that this cloud environment is built and the connection that it has into government environments. So we can't just sell it. I wish we could. I wish we didn't have to, but the government can come and look to see who is who we confirmed as eligible into these environments. And, they do not want international companies within these environments, doing things because, that's why it's a government environment.
But you could have an international company that's part of the DIB.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's plenty of international companies that are currently inside GCC high.
Right. Yeah. Just when you said international companies, I just thought, wait, there's lots of international companies.
And there's a little bit of a trick there too, Mark. So if a international company is a defense contractor, there's a high probability that they're doing it through a U.S. entity. And in order to get through that eligibility process, it would likely have to be that U.S. entity that would be applying for GCC high. Otherwise, the process might take a little bit longer. And another quick trick is making sure that when you go through the eligibility process, just make sure that the name you're submitting matches the name on your CAGE code. Some companies have a lot of different names that they go by, a lot of DBAs, a lot of different business units, and that could get them stuck in the eligibility process.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Most government contracts require FedRAMP moderate, but may not have CUI or FCI. When you state commercial is no longer FedRAMP, is that specific to the DoD? Commercial was never FedRAMP authorized. So M365, our collaboration platform, was never FedRAMP authorized. And any contractual requirement that you have, or any piece of work that you have that would require you to use service providers that are FedRAMP authorized, commercial would not be the right environment for you unless you're prepared to go through the audit and demonstrate that all of those FedRAMP controls were in place, which would be extremely, extremely painful. So for the most part, it'll end up impacting the DoD work, not just work that you might have with a different agency. Although I will say too, any government agency that is consuming a cloud service they have to be FedRAMP authorized. So if what you're offering to the government is an application that is built on Azure, then you're good there, because again, Azure, let me just flip over to my Azure slide real quick. Azure is FedRAMP authorized, right? So you could use that Azure service. It's just when you bring in any M365 capabilities, if that's part of the boundary and the scope. So let me rewind this some and talk to you guys about some of the CMMC materials that we have that you may or may not know about. So we've built a lot of great documentation that you guys could leverage, whether it's for your own CMMC compliance programs or if it's for your customers or for customer engagements. So first and foremost is on our Service Trust portal. You can get the majority of our compliance documentation. So if you need to see a pen test, if you need to see a confirmation of an audit, or if you need some sort of flow down documentation, start at the Service Trust portal. I will say that if you're looking for any documentation associated with GCC High or Azure Gov, you will have to request that. We don't just put it on the Service Trust portal for all to be able to consume it. It's an additional request. We have a CMMC product placemat. How many people have seen that CMMC product placemat? Raise your hand. Cool, a couple people. So I could flash it here on the screen for you guys too and show you. The CMMC as a placemat is a great tool, because what you're able to do is you're able to go in, select what level you're pursuing, and on the left-hand side, which you don't see here, is you can select what license the customer has. And it'll tell you exactly what services help support CMMC practices. So everything in blue means that there's a primary service that can go towards achieving that objective or that requirement. Everything in yellow is a secondary service. And then we also have areas where we have enable enablers, which means it helps, but it doesn't really meet the full requirements. And it'll document as well what is the implementation guidance. So like, what can you do to implement that control using those tools that we believe help you in achieving that requirement? For a lot of companies, they'll just copy and paste that into a SSP if they're doing those things to make their lives easier. So could be a really helpful and effective tool. Building off that tool, we also developed something called our technical reference guide. So when you're going through, if you use the placemat for the first time, you'll see Entra helps with access controls, and you'll say, great, but I'm kind of new to Entra. I want to learn a little bit more about how to achieve, a given requirement. You could go into the technical reference guide, which I think is around 200 pages. And what that'll do is it'll spell out even more for you what you could do in order to achieve each requirement. Where does it map to a NIST 853 requirement? It'll give backlinks to additional documentation, even training links. That way, again, if you're new to that service, you could become familiar with it rather quickly and help provide guidance either to your customers or to your business as needed. We have inside of our SIM tool, which is called Sentinel, we have something called the CMMC solution, which just helps visualize the different practices inside CMMC. For instance, restricting access, you're able to see where are people accessing your environment from. And you could see like, hey, I have somebody accessing my environment from the UK. Do we know of any of our users that are traveling to the UK that have access, or is that something we should look at? So the CMMC solution could be really effective for you guys. We publish a lot of STIGs, so that could be a helpful tool. CISA also released something recently called Scuba Gear, which I always recommend folks to take a look at. It's just hardening guidelines for M365 environment. I think they also have one out for Google and one out for another provider. So take a look at that. Inside Compliance Manager, we have we call it GRC Lite tool that can help you in managing how you're achieving certain controls, and also give you guidance on how to achieve that control. That way it's like right there in the portal. Has anyone used the Compliance Manager, the CMMC assessment templates? Raise your hand if you have. Yeah, highly recommend you guys go take a look at that. Perfect, one person has leveraged it. It's not a silver bullet, but it gives a lot of companies a starting point and a way to get out of Excel, because you could upload evidence, you could document control owners. If there's gaps that need to be filled, you could document who's responsible for those gaps. But it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that maybe a more robust GRC tool would have. But it, again, helps you move in the right direction. And we provide guidance right there of like, if you turn this on, this feature on, this will help in achieving that requirement. Inside of our Azure environment, we have our CMMC regulatory policies. So similar to Compliance Manager, but different. in, what is the scope? The scope of Compliance Manager is your M365 environment plus anywhere where Defender for Cloud is enabled. Whereas Defender for Cloud is strictly your services that are running as infrastructure. So think of any servers, any VMs, and it could be hybrid cloud too. It's not just inside Azure. So if you're using Defender for Cloud, you could use those regulatory policies for your hybrid cloud environments. Then we have our Azure Mission Landing Zone. So for organizations that are brand new to using cloud, but they're trying to get a workload into cloud quickly, we have these landing zones where their infrastructure is code. You could quickly deploy networking, security, access controls to prepare an environment to accept a workload or an application that you might be migrating in. We build these environments to be compliant with certain impact levels. So they could be a really effective tool, again, for somebody that's new to cloud. We have a lot of guidance with our cloud adoption framework. So this is how organizations could slowly mature their capabilities inside of the cloud. We have an enterprise landing zone, not to be confused with this mission landing zone. And built into that are other areas of okay, how can you mature security capabilities? How can you mature access control capabilities? We have something similar for zero trust. So United States federal government is required to adopt zero trust architectures. We've released a ton of material on how to comply with zero trust. And a lot of defense contractors are starting to get in that zero trust mentality, which is hey, no more high walls and, firewalls protect us from everything. Let's assume the worst. Let's assume maybe there's a bad actor in our environment. And let's make sure that we always trust but verify. Let's assume breach. And let's make sure that we have all the right controls in place to prevent against malicious activity. And then we have our Microsoft cybersecurity reference architecture. I'll tell you, this one makes my head spin because there's so many security services that Microsoft has to offer across the whole spectrum of the attack surface. So if you haven't seen that, definitely take a look at it. And then within Entra, there's a lot of security defaults that are enabled. And there's a lot of really strong guidance specifically on how to use Entra with CMMC in particular. So I highly recommend everybody take a look at these. Really good resources, and they'll definitely help you out with customer projects and/or projects for your own business. That's really all the material I had prepared. And
I got a question for you.
Go ahead.
I was on a DIBCAC with an assessment for a C3PAO, and they asked for a SRM or CRM, the Customer Responsibility Matrix, and I had just joined and helping them, and they tried to use, I think it was the product placement map or something like that. Do you have a CRM or SRM that you have generic or that you can provide, or how does that?
We do have a generic one, and customers need to request for that. So, a CRM is a requirement of FedRAMP authorization, and it is one of the attachments to a FedRAMP authorization package, but we don't just hand it out to everybody. So if you need that, I could put the blog in the chat window here before this is over, and it just says the email address that you would reach out to. And you would request it. They would verify that, yes, you have a GCC high tenant and that there's a shared responsibility that we need to maintain. And they would give you that. The key thing as an auditor is verify the scope, right? Is it M365 or is it Azure? Is it Azure Commercial or is it Azure Gov? Because those would be two different CRMs. They might look very, very similar, but the actual audit for each of those is different here on the Microsoft side.
Just one quick question. You mentioned GCC and GCC High and GCC meeting requirements for DFAR 7012 as well. Do OSCs or OSAs need to request the equivalency documentation for that platform, or is there any roadmap to get that one FedRAMP authorized at some point?
Yep. So right now, both of them are FedRAMP authorized, GCC and GCC High. So there's no need to provide a body of evidence, which would include some of the documentation that you would need to support FedRAMP. And that's brand new, last 30 days. So if you asked me back in November, I would say, yes, there's a process to get all that documentation. And customers, should have that before DIBCAC shows up or before you as the auditor shows up. And it would have to be the customer requesting the information, not the auditor requesting the information.
So if I go to the marketplace, I'm going to find both Office 365 and... Because I can only find GCC High, I cannot find GCC within the marketplace. That's the reason I ask.
Yeah, let me just post them in the chat window here real quick for you. So this is the GCC High one, and then I need to go back. Where's this lovely little X? They always change this website on me. I have that up because I'm helping customers frequently with it. Microsoft. And then here is the moderate, aka MT, aka GCC. So keep those two handy. That's what you'll need, that package ID for both of them.
Just here.
Also, Justin, going back to Mark's question about international personnel, DoD contractors having access to GCC High, you mentioned if a company has a cage code, then is that one of the qualifications?
Correct.
Okay, so at that point, a company can sign up with SAM.gov, get their cage code. But at that point, they don't necessarily have to be a contractor or have a contract, but as long as they have that cage code.
As long as they have that cage code, yep.
Okay,
Because what it does is it demonstrates that they're moving in that direction. But again, as an international company, what I've seen is most organizations that are doing work with the United States federal government do the work through a U.S. business entity. So it wouldn't be, Company A International, it'd be Company A US LC or like, I don't know the naming of it, but
What about for companies overseas, let's say customers in Europe or even Asia, and they provide service to the government locally? What solutions can they be offered?
What solutions could be offered? Well, we can't offer anything until they're confirmed as eligible. So as far as our GCC and GCC High and DoD environments go, until they're confirmed as eligible, there's nothing that we could offer. Once they're confirmed as eligible, then anything is available to them that you're at least seeing right here. I should highlight this when I say anything. So this little part. There's other Microsoft environments, right? Like they can't use DoD, they can't use the classified environments because that has separate processes. But that'll at least get them started.
Justin, can you talk about the process of someone purchasing those GCC High licenses? I know you mentioned that Microsoft doesn't sell those directly.
Yeah. So if a company is trying to purchase GCC High licenses or even GCC licenses, they're going to most likely buy those through an indirect channel. That's what we call it, which would be a reseller. And for GCC, there's two different programs that they could buy those licenses through. One is called CSP, and then the other is AOSG. So they could purchase it through either of those two vehicles. If they have a enterprise agreement with Microsoft, which means they buy directly from Microsoft, then they could, buy those licenses from us. In order to have a direct contract with Microsoft, it's typically businesses that are over 500 licensed users. For GCC High could only be purchased through AOSG or through direct if you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. You cannot buy it through a CSP. So what it looks like is, you probably think you have a GCC High requirement. You talk to a Microsoft partner, whether they're a licensed partner or not. You learn that, yes, you have to do GCC High because of whatever your contractual requirements are. You go and you complete our eligibility form, which I could also put that in the chat if you'd like. And then after you complete that eligibility form, you get an email specifying what category you're eligible at. And then you can use that and provide it back to one of the resellers saying, look, I'm confirmed eligible. Here's the level. And that'll be the key to unlock the door to our government cloud services. And then it'll probably take you a little while to get a contract in place. And then after you get that contract in place, you'll be sent an email to activate the licenses. And, there's lots of tips and tricks when activating those licenses too. So that's kind of the process there.
Thank you. All right. Open it up. Anyone else have questions? I know I have a ton, so I'll let the audience go first.
In terms of functionality, because I've noticed that there are some situations where not all the solutions are available within GCC or GCC High. For example, when we use SharePoint in commercial and we deploy Power BI for building graphs and charts, that kind of functionality is kind of reduced within GCC and GCC High. So the question is there any roadmap or something else that we need to consider when we move into those environments?
Awesome question. So anytime there's a parity that you come across, don't assume someone else has identified it. Don't assume that Microsoft is building a solution. Instead, the best thing that you could do is open up a support ticket to, call out the parity. And then that'll get on Microsoft Engineering's radar. That way appropriate plans could be made. So make sure you're always completing support tickets if you come across parity. Are we working on that specific use case? I don't hear from any of my customers that they're having problems inside Power BI or Power Platform. The problem that I am aware of associated with those two platforms is what is the guest experience like? But that is, and I could dive into that here if you want, but I don't hear of parity problems in building reports, building visuals, building, automation workflows. I hear, a problem with the guest experience inside those platforms.
Gotcha.
And I put those two emails in the chat window for you, Mark. At some point of a customer's journey, they're going to have to think through, like, if I'm going to build out a net new environment because I want to put CUI in an enclave, what does that enclave look like? Like, am I putting only a handful of users in it? Am I putting the whole business in it? At which case it's not an enclave. How do I expect people to use that platform? And the more you could have users on a single platform that takes out the potential for end user risk and accident, like, oops, I accidentally shared a file with the wrong person because I just didn't know any better, the better off you are security wise and then end user experience wise. End users are always going to make mistakes. So if you can have a platform help mitigate those mistakes as much as possible using things like sensitivity labels as an example, that way if they accidentally share something with someone that isn't authorized, automatically the platform doesn't let that additional person see it. Or even, to your point earlier about Power BI, you don't really want to share Power BI data across clouds. So, the more you can have people looking at that information within the same cloud and accessing that data from the same cloud is beneficial. And then if you have customers that are using enclaves, how are they accessing those enclaves? Based on how they're accessing those enclaves, are there still security protection assets that are being managed by the corp side of the business? And if it is, then what does that do in terms of scope, and at what point does it stop?
Awesome. So Justin, in regards to advising clients that are considering whether they need GCC or GCC high, how do you typically help them make that decision?
Yeah, it starts with knowing your data, right? So question number one is, what data do you have? And if ITAR comes up, it's like, okay, do you know where ITAR data is? If the answer is no, you almost have to assume it could be anywhere, right? The follow-up question to that is, what users need to have access to ITAR? And again, typically in my experience, customers just don't know. So you start with a large scope. Now, another way is if ITAR does not come up, and it's okay, we know we will have this contractual requirement in the future. It's kind of a conversation of how much of your business is dedicated to pursuing government work. If it's just a small portion, maybe you start out with a small environment. And then the third way that these conversations could go down is, let's say you don't have ITAR, but you have CUI. Do you know where the CUI is? Do you know the types of CUI? If yes, great, because you might only need a GCC environment, or maybe there's a way to do something with commercial, big, maybe, but you might not need GCC highs. Does the customer know the data? That's starting point number one. Go ahead, Israel.
Sorry, I was double muted. Yeah, so I wanted to know what all is entailed in making a conversion from GCC to GCC high. Say, should the scope change later on, you do get the client does get a contract that inquires managing ITAR.
I love that question. Some companies will look at these different cloud environments and they'll say, I'm in commercial today or I'm on-prem today, and because we don't have ITAR, I'm going to go with GCC for now. Until in the future, I know I might need something else. And one of the unfortunate things is if I flip back over to this other chart, where is it? Sorry, everyone, bear with me while I find, here it is, this one. The unfortunate thing is if you go the GCC route first, remember that world is not designed to talk to these worlds. So how often are you trying to communicate with an upstream prime contractor or with DoD directly? Because there might be an end user experience impact. But if we throw that aside and we just think about migration, when you move from commercial or on-prem into GC, depending on what services you have, you're going to have to pick up all the underlying data, right? So let's just use email as an example. You're going to pick up all that email and you're going to put in a U-Haul truck, theoretically, and you're going to move it over into GCC. And if you have to go to GCC high, it's the same thing. You have to move it over again. It's a full move. So, do you want to potentially have to move twice? That's the question I always ask people as they're thinking through this, which cloud is right for me. Because really the only reason why folks consider GCC is because it's slightly less expensive. So, which is fair. So it's a full migration. I would also say that if you have a customer that's using on-prem services, so they're using SharePoint server maybe, or they're using Exchange server, that's also a full migration to upgrade to the next version. So like if they're at I think it's 2016 and they're trying to move to 2019 to buy themselves another year before they need to make bigger decisions, that's still a full migration. So how many times do you want to migrate? And the migrations are tough too, because it's not like if you have a customer that's here and they're large enough, to somebody's earlier point about Power BI, they're probably using Power BI. They're using email. They're using SharePoint. They're using OneDrive. They're using, OneNote and Word. They're using all the services to get all the value out of the platform. And to pick all that up and move it over here is tough. So the faster companies could do it, easier it is. Like the lower down in adoption of the M365 platform, the easier the migration ultimately is. I'm curious, how many folks here have been through a full audit with customers so far? Maybe show of hands. What do you think is the biggest challenge? So 2 people plus I know Mark because he asked the question earlier. What do you think the biggest challenge is that those companies going through the DIBCAC assessment had in terms of preparation? Like, did they share anything with you that they struggled with in getting ready for that audit?
I guess it's mostly the readiness portion. They don't put enough thought and resources on building up a, let's say, strong documentation and processes. Because if they do, then the audit is pretty easy. Going through an audit is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. The way I come across that is I see either companies not thoroughly documenting, and like one of my qualifying questions sometimes to people is, how many pages is your SSP? Because that'll tell me a lot about the maturity of the organization. And then the other question, at some point it'll come up is like, how'd you document your policies and procedures? Did you use some template because it was quick and easy? Or do you have somebody in the background that is, manually writing those, or using a C3PAO in an advisor capacity, not as your auditor, but somebody that has been through the audit, clearly understands the requirements, and they're custom tailoring a bunch of policies to your organization. Because sometimes people just, buy policies and procedures and say, yep, I'm going to use these, but then they don't actually implement them. Any other thoughts from anyone else that's gone through a DIBCAC of what the challenge was from the company?
Here's a question that is kind of peripherally related to when you start talking about company policies. And I'm on the commercial side. Is C3PO, is the government asking, are you following your own company policies in creating your policies and approving them?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is how will we have to prove it, right? Like if we give an auditor a policy, how will that be tested? Is that right?
Well, even more general than that, has that policy been approved according to the mechanisms that company has as far as developing and implementing policies?
I don't know if the auditor looks at that, but any C3PAOs in the room that want to take that question.
Because it would be inconsistent from an assurance standpoint that, we've got this body of policies for, say, a government for a contractor entity on the government side, when in fact, if they're part of the larger corporate entity and they're not only following their corporate policies as far as developing and implementing policies. There's an inconsistency there.
Sometimes there's even a conflict between the parent company's policies and the subsidiary.
That can easily be resolved. But from the standpoint, if the government entities doesn't approve policies for
the government doesn't approve policies. The government is not going to provide you with templates or with the means to to set your own policies. What the DPCAC auditor or C3PO auditors do is they just review your policies, what you did to meet each NIST 171 requirement, and then just remember there are 3 examination methods. So the examination is just review your documentation, and then the second method is interview. So what the DPAO will do is they will review the document and then ask you if you are actually doing it, so or how you implemented it. So those are the methods that are available to the auditor.
Perhaps, okay, maybe I've deviated this, but
I get what you're saying. You're kind of saying like, what if the policies were never actually approved, but the policies are being provided as evidence that they are in place and operational?
what I'm saying is many companies have a process for policy standard approval. Is the government entity, when they get, say, a policy template and update it, have they followed that approval process that is established by that corporate entity?
Yeah, I think that ties into the revision history, and that is something that assessors are going to look at to make sure when the last time that policy was updated and reviewed, and who is the owner or sponsor of that policy. Is that kind of what you're referring to, Rick?
Again, I'm coming from corporate, too much corporate, as it is. For a policy to be effective, it needs to be approved by, say, a committee within the company itself for it to be effective.
I would just say, Rick, every company has a different governance structure, and the C3POs are coming in to audit you against the security controls of 171. As long as the policy is in place, has the approval history, I don't think they care about what happened prior to approval and what process was followed in order to generate that policy. They just care that the policy exists.
You actually said a very important word, to approval within that company.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead. You had another question?
I was just going to say, you have to have a policy on all that approvals, and then that you need to make sure it's followed. So whoever the right person to approve that policy is, that needs to be followed. It just is consistency. So if you're saying, hey, we need vice president level approval, then that's who needs to be approving everything. You have to say what you're going to do and do what you say. And as long as it's acceptable and you can show that it's valuable and efficient and effective, then that's fine.
That's all I was trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I want to ask real quick, Justin, what tools or resources does Microsoft provide, if any, to help defense contractors try to identify that CUI or find it? Any data discovery tools or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I guess I glanced over that. So great little question. Thanks for asking that. So inside Microsoft, there's a capability called Purview. And under that umbrella, there's a lot of data protection capabilities, one of which is Content Explorer. So you can go and you could scan your environment for certain attributes. And there's a variety of ways to do this, right? Like you could look for pre-canned sensitive information types, which we have a lot of them. So things like social security numbers or license numbers. We don't have a sensitive information type built out for CUI because there's a lot. But you could do a dictionary search where you're looking for the word CUI space. And, as long as data is marked appropriately, then it'll detect that and it'll show you exactly where it's stored and who the owner of that file is. So that could be a really, really helpful tool to help identify where it is. And you could scan not only in cloud, but you could scan on-prem as well to find that data. So wonderful tool. Inside Azure, we build upon those capabilities to also give you the ability to do data lineage. So what's the lineage of a particular document, and do data mapping. So how do different pieces of data come together to make this piece of data? So Purview is what you're looking for. And I would encourage any auditor, any assessor, to maybe incorporate that into the non-assessment, like if you're doing a gap assessment, if you're doing advisory, if you're doing discovery, hop into a Microsoft Purview. It's available for any M365 customer, and use Content Explorer and just do a quick dictionary search. Like, did we identify the places where CUI is? And that is a quick way to tell you.
Hey, this is Israel. I've got a follow-on question there. Can you tell us how we could possibly leverage free hardened CMMC images on, say, for instance, Windows 365 Cloud PC instances, as well as how we might possibly leverage CMMC level 2 definitions?
Yep. So we don't have like a STIG built out for Windows 365 CMMC. So there's not necessarily that silver bullet. We have documentation that if you email me, and I'll put my email address in the window here, I could get you it for Windows 365. I'm not sure if it's posted on any of our websites yet, but we're working towards that. But in terms of like configurations, there's two things that you probably want to leverage. One is either a technical reference guide, which will spell out architectural decisions or architectural choices that you can make in order to adopt some of the security services. Or a lot of our customers will have like pre-built environments that you just could purchase and use their architecture that they feel meets all the CMMC requirements. And I guess a third option too, there's a tool that we have, it's open source, it's called the M365 DSC. And what it does is it allows you to scan an environment. So let's say you know an environment that is CMMC compliant because let's say it's your own, right? You had to build it as a C3PAO. You could scan your own environment and then you can export those configurations and then you could import them into a new tenant. So, that's another option for you. So I guess that would be option 3. Microsoft.
And then my last question is, I've heard a lot of talks about it being difficult going through the process of getting like the SAR and the CRM, the customer responsibility matrix. Is there any tips that you can provide us to help streamline that process of getting that information?
Yeah, so absolutely. The first thing is in the past 30 days, GCC High is now FedRAMP authorized. So you don't need the SAR or a lot of what's included in the body of evidence. You still need the CRM. So part of my day job is I talk to customers about like, hey, are you ready? What do you need? Part of what do you need is, do you already have a copy of the CRM? Because what you should be doing like months and months before an audit is sitting down, looking at that CRM and saying, here's where Microsoft brings the ball to. Here's where I need to keep driving it downfield. So all of your controls, all of them, all of your policies should be based on the CRM from any of your vendors. Now in practice, and from what I've seen, it's not how a lot of companies that have gone through the DIB-CACs are doing it. In fact, you'd be surprised by how many are in the middle of a DIB-CAC and they tell us, hey, I was just asked for the CRM. How fast can you get it to us? So my advice is one of the early steps you need to do as part of building out a CMMC compliance program is get the CRM from Microsoft. I put in the chat window the email address where you would email to grab that CRM and map your controls against that. And it holds true for any of your cloud service providers, any of them. So anywhere where you have a CUI asset.
Fantastic. Well, Justin, this was a remarkable presentation. Really appreciate you sharing your insights, answering questions. And we definitely need more of this. Applaud you for that. Before I let you go, I know you and I have been working in the context of CMMC Professionals Network to try to get our members more hands-on training, CMMC ecosystem, actually help them be able to figure out how to configure the settings for CMMC and so forth. I know we may be on the brink of announcing some good news. Do you want to share that now, or you want to wait till we meet later and come back and share?
I would say in the near future, your community will have access to modular-based training that will give them the ability to learn up on certain domains and be able to play that on demand. So for instance, if you're trying to learn about access controls and how to implement or test access controls for an M365 customer, or how to build in those access control requirements, you'll be able to use this modular-based training in order to do it. The training is designed for folks that have already sat through a CCP class, because we're not going to show the 171 basics or the CMMC basics. Instead, we're going to talk about, okay, now that we know we need to do this, now that we know what the program is, now that we know all that, we want to know how to do it on the Microsoft platform or how to verify that's in place. That's what this training will achieve. And hopefully very soon, anyone listening to this webinar will have access to that data.
Very exciting. Oh, that's breaking news. All right. So
right here.
Justin, how can the folks get in contact with you?
Yeah, I put my email address in the chat window. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always open for conversations, especially when we're exchanging some lessons learned. So reach out, let's have a conversation. Would love to see and hear what you're hearing, and maybe share some other insights with you as well.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Are you struggling with CMMC compliance? Feeling stuck and uncertain about your career path in cybersecurity? Imagine having a clear path, expert mentorship, and a supportive community to help you master CMMC and thrive in your career. If you're just looking for another certification, this may not be for you. But if you're committed to making an impact, keep watching. Welcome to CPN, a mission-driven community empowering cybersecurity professionals with the resources, real-world experience, and mentorship needed for success in the CMMC ecosystem. At CPN, we focus on quality training, meaningful mentorship, and a strong network that prepares you to support the defense industrial base with confidence. Join us today and start advancing in your career with the guidance you deserve. Gain insights from experts, build hands-on experience, and connect with a network that supports your growth. With CPN, you're never alone in your CMMC journey.